I never thought I would be the kind of person to write a story like this. I'm a realist by nature. I work long shifts as a maintenance tech for a power co-op that services a spread of rural communities out west of San Angelo. And most nights, I'm too tired to do anything except microwave dinner and fall asleep to the weather report. I didn't go looking for attention or clicks or supernatural nonsense. The thing that happened to me doesn't benefit me in any way, because I can't tell it without making myself look weak and a little bit crazy. But I need to record it somewhere, and I need somebody to read it and tell me whether I'm losing my mind or if there's a pattern to what I lived through. If there is, I need to know before I make a choice I don't think I can take back. The first time I noticed anything wrong was the night the substation alarm tripped during a thunderstorm that never arrived. We were supposed to get a line of storms rolling up from the Pecos, a big show on the radar that fizzled into high, dry air by the time it reached the Concho Valley. I had been tracking it on my phone while rewrapping a frayed insulator. The sky was that tight brown color you get before a dust storm, the wind shaking the guy wires with that eerie singing sound. The alarm pinged a door open on the remote shed west of Carlsbad, not even the one with the expensive gear. Just the cinder block closet where we keep dead meters and a coffee can full of rusted bolts. I drove out because I was closest. And I didn't want to listen to dispatch try to round up someone else on overtime while I waited in my truck eating stale sunflower seeds. I took US 87 north and cut onto a farm-to-market road that runs level 4 or 5 miles and then dips and rises, like a roller coaster over creek beds that only remember water. The sun went down behind a wall of dust, and the world turned the color of a bruise. When I got to the turnoff, the mesquite tops were shivering even though there was no sound of wind anymore. The air smelled like hot pennies. I parked by the chain link, keyed in the padlock code, and swung the gate wide. Gravel popped. Under my boots, I unlocked the shed and clicked the light. It was a weak fluorescent with a ballast that buzzed like a giant mosquito. There was the shelf of dead meters, the coil of guy wire, the coffee can of bolts. There was the desk with a blotter calendar from 2012 that we kept meaning to throw away, and the wobbly metal chair. And there was the muddy handprint on the wall. 5 fingers splayed, thumbs smudged short. It wasn't mud. I knew it the second I smelled it. It was that iron smell, the copper stink that doesn't lie, metallic and sweet and rotten all at once. I've been around plenty of blood in my life. I broke my head open on a trailer hitch as a kid. I helped pull a farmer out of his auger when I was 23 and he slipped the wrong way and we didn't get there fast enough. Blood turns black. On concrete, it turns brown on cotton. On painted cinder block, this was a dark red-brown that had dried to the shape of a hand bigger than mine. I set my flashlight under my chin and leaned in and saw whirls of prints in the stain, like it had been pressed there hard enough to leave the pattern of skin. I checked the door. The hasp was intact. The lock had to be cut to get in, and mine wasn't. The walls were solid. No windows. There was no smear, no drag. Just that one handprint like someone had pushed the whole world away and then left. I backed out and let the door close with the weight of the light turning itself off. The yard around me felt too flat and too quiet. You know that desert silence where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, and it feels like the sky is listening. I called dispatch and told them the alarm was false and I'd do a full check. I didn't tell them about the handprint. I've never called in something I can't quantify. I walked the fence line with my lamp. Rabbits spooked in needle flashes. A nightjar flushed and skimmed across the top of the substation like a thrown hat. Everything looked normal until I circled around to the east fence and saw the wash beyond it. A shallow scrape of caliche and drifted thorn that runs down to a culvert under the county road. There were boot prints on the far side, single file, not many. I'd call them men's boots, but that was a guess. The prints came up out of the wash at an angle, and stopped at the fence like they'd been following the boundary. I swung the light back and forth to catch the pattern. They weren't my boot prints. The toe was more pointed, the heel narrowed. They were deeper than mine, which argued for someone heavier or someone carrying something. The stride was a little long. They ended at a coyote hole where the fence, looser wire, had been pulled back and retwisted by something with hands. That was the first thing. It wasn't the worst. The worst things come slow. I told myself kids had crawled in. There were beer cans on the shoulder 100 yards down. Maybe they wanted to hang out at the substation and dare each other to touch the fence. Even though anybody who lives here long enough learns not to do that. I locked the gate and drove home. On the way back, I saw the storm trying to be a storm, flickering like a brain behind the horizon, and I thought, if it had come through, the handprint would have washed away and I'd have slept better that night. When I got home, my sister had left me a Tupperware of enchiladas she said she was trying a new recipe for. And I put them in the fridge and stood at the sink with the tap running until the water got cold, hands braced on either side. I found myself looking at my own palms like I expected them to be stained. They were clean and dry and boring. I made myself eat one plate of enchiladas, and the first bite tasted like a mouthful of rust. I microwaved them longer and put more salsa and got through it. I slept with the TV on because the sound of the weatherman talking about rainfall totals made me feel less stupid than leaving a lamp lit. The substation alarm didn't ping again for 6 days. Regular days, routine service work, a ground rod to reseat, a transformer check after someone took out a pole with a stock trailer. The wind shifted back to the south and brought blue sky that looked like God had polished it. I thought about calling the county sheriff to ask if there had been any reports of a missing person or some other thing that would make a handprint in a locked shed make sense. I didn't. The longer I didn't, the harder it was to explain why I hadn't when it happened. It felt like bad luck to say it out loud, like calling it by name would invite it in. On the 7th day, a Sunday, the alarm went off again. Same shed, same door open. It was full daylight, mid-afternoon. I'd planned to take my nephew to shoot cans on his grandparents' land. I told him I had to swing by a site first and to come along. He could help me check the fence. He's 14. He thinks I'm boring until I hand him a .22, and then I'm acceptable. He was quiet on the drive. He scrolled his phone and let the mesquite pass behind his head. Out here, the cell coverage goes from 3 bars to 0, like a switch if you dip behind a ridge, and I watched him tilt the phone toward the windshield to grab a little bit of signal when he could. I reached the gate, punched in the code, and he hopped out first like he didn't want to look eager. I didn't want him to see the handprint. I told him to walk the fence clockwise and I'd take counterclockwise, meet at the back corner. I opened the shed and the light flickered on and steadied. The handprint was still there. I had half convinced myself I'd imagined the iron smell. In the daylight, I could see what I hadn't seen in the ugly fluorescent. There were faint smudges. Lower to the right, like knuckles had pushed off. I put my hand up beside it and saw I'd been wrong. It wasn't bigger than mine. It was the same size. The thumb wasn't short. It was pressed separately, just slightly offset, like the hand had been at a bad angle or like one finger had been brought down a split second later. I took a picture, then felt sick about taking a picture and deleted it, as if the phone would carry something I couldn't control. I found my nephew at the east fence, crouched by the coyote hole. "Something got under here," he said, like a game warden. "Look at the hair." He plucked a tuft of pale coarse hair from the lower wire and held it up. It looked like deer hair, the kind that comes off in big bunches during the spring. Shetty pulled at the wire. "You want me to twist this tight?" "After we walk the rest," I said. He nodded and moved, patient. I waited so I could look at the ground without him watching. The boot prints were there on the far side of the wash. Same stride, same angle, and I thought I saw a place where something like a knee had pushed in. What they weren't, this time, were alone. There was a set beside them, smaller, toned. Want to make that detail work harder than it has to? I don't want to write the word child, maybe a small adult, maybe a teenager, maybe my mind making patterns in a mess of blown dust. But the smaller prints were there. They came up to the fence, they stopped. And the larger prints stuttered at that point like a person coming out of a walk into a half-run and then stopping hard. We tightened the wire. I scolded my nephew about never crossing fences without permission, as if I was trying to shape the world back into something sensible. And then we went to his grandparents' place, and we shot aluminum cans and armadillos that dug into the septic field, and for those hours. The sun came back, and the earth was specific, and nothing hurt. You know how a story like this goes? You keep waiting for the moment when I hit the thing with my truck, or when I found the body, or when my nephew disappeared. I wish it was that simple. I wish I could point to a date and an hour and say, that's when it failed. Instead, it came. Unlike a fever in stages, each stage feeling like I could still argue it away. The phone calls started the next week. Our cope has a phone tree that calls out to the on-duty tech when a substation alarm trips. It's an old system, stubborn and reliable, runs off a copper landline in a little office with a dead mouse in the ceiling. The first time it rang, I looked at the screen and saw the cope caller ID. I answered and said my name. There was no one there. There wasn't a click either, not a dial tone, not a robotic voice. The line was open the way a door is open too. A room you don't want to look into. I said hello again. I heard something I thought was wind through leaves. The line clicked dead. I called dispatch and asked if they'd pinged me, and they said no. We hadn't had any alarms, and the phone tree was quiet. I told myself, wrong number, crosswire. Some old lady trying to call her cousin in Bollinger and hitting a 7 instead of a 9. The second time it rang. I was on US 277 heading south at 3 in the morning to fix a fault near Cristobal that had shut off a pump. The road in that stretch runs flat as a promise, and a train sometimes cuts across the horizon like a lit necklace on a long black throat. The display said the coupe again. The line opened. The voice I heard was my own. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't me on my voicemail or a clip of myself. It was the way I sound when I'm bone-tired and not thinking about how I sound. That half-breathed growl like the gravel road you drive too fast, and the first words it said were you need to turn around. I kept driving because that's what people do when they don't know why they've started to be afraid. I said, "What is this?" And my voice on the line said, "You need to turn around because there's a truck without lights. You won't see it until it's there." A pause that wasn't a pause, just a breath that I recognized as my own. Please don't keep going. I reached to hang up because fear makes you do dumb, brave things to prove you can. I kept the phone by my ear because fear also makes you follow the curses you already know. "Who is this?" I said. The voice swore softly, the way I do when I almost drop a wrench. "God, you stubborn idiot," it said. And then the line stayed open, and all I could hear was my own breath, which I didn't want to notice matched the breath on the phone. The road was empty in front of me. It was so empty that I could see the way the headlights curved with the slight tilt of the county line. The bugs flying through the beams in their blind little crosses. I put the phone on the seat without hanging up. I don't know why I did, but I pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out. I watched the road ahead. Far away, there was a glow like a far-off farmhouse window. It was the top of the hill, catching the moon. I felt sick to my stomach, which is not a rational response to a hill. I had the thought, this is stupid, which was the last thought I had before the truck without lights came over the rise. It wasn't a ghost. It was a real truck. It was going too fast, and it was hauling a stock trailer with a busted tongue that made it shimmy like a fish so hard that when it hit the bottom of the little dip, it jerked sideways and dragged the back end into my lane, and would have killed me if I'd been where I should have been if I'd kept driving at the same speed. It corrected and went on. I saw it years, and I saw it no time at all, and then it was gone around the bend, still dark, still stupid, still alive. I sat on the gravel and put my head between my knees the way I have not done since I was a kid, getting my breath back after a Charlie horse. My phone on the seat beside me spoke once, my voice saying, "Quiet now." The line cut. I drove to fix the fault, and my hands shook the whole time I opened the panel. I didn't tell dispatch. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't tell my nephew. I played it through my head and tried to rearrange it into an explanation that didn't include what it included. I decided someone was playing a prank. The Cope's phone tree is old, but not airtight. Somebody could spoof the caller ID. Somebody could record my voice and time a call to startle me. And if they got lucky with the truck, that would be on them, not me. If this is hard to read, it's harder to live. Because once you know that a thing can simply happen, it takes work every second to pretend it can't. After the second call, I started looking for the substation handprint again. It crossed my mind that the two weren't related. It crossed my mind that they were so related that I didn't know where one ended and the other began. I drove to the shed on my lunch hour. I told myself I was checking the door requite. I unlocked it and clicked the light and had a flash of disappointment, which feels like madness to confess because I didn't want to see it and I was angry when I didn't. The handprint was gone. The wall was scabbed with the pale scrape of a fresh paint job. Not a good one. A slap of semi-gloss that looked wet even though it was dry. The coffee can of bolts was in the wrong place, and I let a single bolt fall just to hear it ring. On the desk, the old blotter calendar lay open to July like it had been, but the date square for the 17th had a small circle drawn in the corner in blue pen. The ink had bled into the paper in a way that said cheap, slow, and recent. I don't like to be observed when I don't know who is watching. I set the calendar back into its dust, and the dust didn't smear. And I felt something small in my chest, like a ball of string, go tight. When the third call came, I was in my kitchen, eating a bowl of cereal, because I had forgotten to buy eggs again, and the only bread I had was freezer burned. The caller ID said the Cope. I put the phone on speaker. My voice said, "Don't go to the shed," and for one brief, sane second, I felt relief. Because if this was a prank, then it was a prank that was starting to be obvious. I said, "Whoever you are, good job. You got me. I'm laughing. Now stop." My voice on the phone said, "You know that's not how this works." And I felt my feet get colder because that sounded like the kind of thing I would think to say to myself when I was trying to break out of an argument with my own stubbornness. Then the phone went quiet. There was a small sound, like a car blinker far away, or like the snap of someone rubbing finger and thumb together nervously. I realized it was my refrigerator cycling. I went anyway. Because that is the other thing fear does. It drives you toward the thing that scares you, hoping you can pace it or catch it by surprise. I told myself I was closing out a work order. I told myself I didn't want to bring this to my boss without facts. I told myself that the drive would wear it off me. I drove fast. I passed the turnoff where the road dips and rises, and I watched the curve of the land like it would tell me whether the world was about to change. It didn't. It held itself like a face in a passport photo. I parked at the gate and got out and saw that the chain link had a section where the diamond pattern went a little sideways, the way old fences do when cattle lean on them year after year. It shouldn't have bothered me, and it did, wildly. I unlocked the shed and clicked the light and saw the wall with the shiny patch of paint and was hit so hard by a smell that I put my hand over my mouth. It wasn't the iron stink. It was rot, fat and sweet. The smell of a deer in August that got clipped and crawled into a ditch to lie in water and give itself back. The smell had weight. It had a temperature. 'Twas dread in a body. I pulled my shirt up over my face and made myself step in and looked down and saw nothing on the floor but dust and the scurry line of a field mouse. The smell came from the wall with the new paint. It was stronger near where the handprint had been. I put my palm flat. The cinder block was warmer than the air. There was the smallest give to it I would have sworn was impossible. I felt the wall breathe once. It pressed my hand back, and I jerked away so hard I knocked the coffee can of bolts off the shelf with my elbow. They spilled like marbles. One rolled in a circle and came to rest right between my boots. I locked the shed, walked the fence line. At the east fence, the coyote hole was twisted again, wire pulled back from the post and then rewrapped by hands, not paws. On the far side of the wash, the boot prints were arranged like the echo of a failed decision. The larger set led away toward the road, then returned, then led away again, shorter, then returned and stopped. The smaller set stood in one place, like someone afraid to step off a cliff. I turned my head, absurdly, because the air felt colder on one side of my face. I drove to the sheriff's office. I rehearsed a story where I said kids had been messing with the fence and I needed a deputy to swing by more often. And if they asked for specifics, I would mention the boot prints, not the handprint, not the breath, not the phone calls. I got as far as the parking lot. I sat in my truck with the engine running and my hands on the wheel, and I made it as far as the doorknob in my mind. I thought about going inside and giving them a story and seeing something in their eyes that said they were only humoring me, which would make what was happening only mine. I drove away and told myself to come back later. At home, I ran the shower, hot enough to pink my skin, and I stood under it and pressed my forehead against the tile and thought about the smell, the way it had weight. And I remembered being a kid and falling asleep in the back of my parents' old Suburban on the way home from my grandma's house. The seat hot and the vinyl smell rising after the sun went down. How safe I had felt even when we passed the dark line of the river and I imagined a monster living under the bridge. The memory comforted me by hurting. I got out and toweled off and stood there listening, as if the house had lungs. The quiet felt like the moment before you say something out loud that will change you. My sister called. She said my nephew wanted to know if I could take him to the Devil's River the next weekend to fish for catfish. I said I'd let her know. And then I said I should probably be the one to ask him because I needed to apologize for snapping at him about the fence. She said he hadn't mentioned it. He's a good kid. He carries excuses for other people like groceries. The fourth call came late. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on. The weatherman doing that thing where he points at nothing and makes it sound like a promise. The phone's buzz startled me, and I swiped without looking because my body was ahead of my mind. The Cope ID was on the screen. I sat up. A voice on the phone said, "Don't let him come with you," and there was a sound in the background, like rushing water that I think now was just the static of an old line. And then my voice said, "You can still avoid it." It said avoid like it was trying to use a word I would trust. It cut off before I could formulate what to say. I held the phone and looked at the old photo on my coffee table of my nephew at age 8 in a baseball uniform, glove on his head, like a hat. I slept badly that night. The wind was up, and the house creaked on its foundation like something wedging itself inside. I told my nephew we would go to the river. I told myself if I changed my behavior because of prank calls, I would never forgive myself because the answer to being scared is not to hide from the places you love. I packed a cooler and a tackle box and extra water and an old wool blanket because desert nights can be mean even in May. We drove out before dawn. Highway 277 again. Then the little roads. Then the long literal gravel toward the pecan bottoms. where the water looks like glass thrown over stairs. My nephew fell asleep with his face against the passenger window and woke up at first light with a crease down his cheek like a scar. He was quiet, the way kids get when they feel the hum of something bigger. He asked if he could drive the last mile. I told him when he had a learner's permit and not before. He acted offended and smiled at the windshield at the river we parked. Under the shadow of the bridge where the concrete keeps its cool even in August. And we carried our gear down to a flat of rock where a big tamarisk used to be before the flood 2 years ago ate it. The water wasn't high. It moved with that deceptive laziness that will take your feet if you step wrong. We set up. We cast lines. My nephew asked if he could go along the bank to look for fossils. I said yes, and then said no, and then said yes, because I hated that I had said no. And I told him to stay where I could see him and call if he went around the bend. He came back sooner than I expected. He had the look on his face kids get when they want to ask you something they think you won't like. He said, "Have you been here with someone else?" I said I had been here with his grandpa and with friends from high school and with his mom and with him, but not recently. He said, "Because I saw a blanket." He pointed downstream where the wall-eyed green runs wide and then narrows before. The first riffle. I set the pole in the holder and we picked our way along the edge. The blanket was on a low shelf of rock above the waterline, folded. It was the same kind as the one in my truck. Army surplus wool. Brown-gray, scratchy. There were 2 enamel mugs placed upside down, side by side, like someone had set them to drain. There was a stack of paper and a large clip, the kind people use in offices, with a rubber band that had left a dark line where it had rested. My nephew reached for the paper because that is what 14-year-old boys do when confronted with a mystery, I said, too sharply. "Don't touch that," and he snapped his hand back and gave me a look like I'd slapped him. I picked up the stack. The top page was blank, except for a print that wasn't a print, a discoloration, a faint oval of oil, the kind you leave when your skin brushes paper. There was a smell. It wasn't the smell from the shed. It was the smell a house has after you move out. Something like dust under a refrigerator. It made me feel like I was trespassing in a church. The second page had writing on it. The handwriting was mine. I recognized the way I loop my G like a fishhook and the way I cross my T in a hurry if I'm thinking about the next word. The date at the top said 07/17. There was no year. There were words I don't remember writing, a story in my voice, something about a shed and a handprint and a set of boot prints and a call from my own number. Then the narrative swerved. It talked about the river. It talked about a choice. It talked about how people like me think we can lean on the fence of a thing and hold it in place with our bodies, and how that never works when the thing is not a fence, but a door. I read the first paragraph and had to sit because the words had the quality of being almost true, but slightly wrong. The way dreams substitute one face for another and tell you to accept it. My nephew said, "You wrote that?" "No," I said. And I could hear how unconvincing I was, to him and to myself. I turned the page. The third sheet had a handprint on it, faint as a watermark. The paper puckered under where the heel of the palm had pressed. The little finger was slightly offset from the others, as if the hand had been at a bad angle. I stood up fast, and the blood drained out of my head so hard I had to put my hand against the rock to keep from falling. I put the stack back under the clip and set the mugs on top. I took my nephew by the shoulder and told him we were moving back to our spot upstream. He pulled away. He is 14. He has not yet learned that sometimes you have to let an adult be crazy to keep them from breaking. He said, "What is it?" with a mix of curiosity and that working kind of fear that you can ride like a bicycle. I couldn't explain in a way that would make sense. I said, "I just don't like it," and he said, "Okay," and shrugged. Like he was willing to live with my small, ordinary failures because I make good pancakes on Saturday sometimes. We fished until the sun was a fist on the back of my neck. We caught nothing. The river was loud the way it gets when it wants you to turn your head. I kept noticing the shape of the bridge shadow creeping like a clock hand and the slow swing of the spider on the web between the reeds. Once my nephew laughed out loud at something on his phone, and the sound dragged along the water and came back to us wrong. When we packed up, I folded my blanket and put it in the truck and did not look downstream to ward the other blanket on the shelf because I already knew what I would see if I looked, which was just a blanket and mugs and a clip and paper and no one else, which would have been worse than seeing someone. As I turned the key, I had the sense of a weight settling into the bed of the truck that wasn't our gear. I told myself it was my imagination, the last tool I owned that worked. We didn't talk much on the drive back. At the long flat north of the river, we passed a pulled-over state trooper giving someone a lecture through their passenger window. My nephew fell asleep again with his face turned toward the dash. At the turnoff that dips and rises, the wind blew from the east, and the mesquite leaned its thin shoulders away, and the sky looked like it was made of tin. The phone didn't ring. I kept waiting for it to, and felt something like disappointment when it didn't, because at least then it would be a known unknown. I dropped my nephew at my sister's and told her he'd been good, which was true. And she said I had a look on my face like I'd smelled something dead, and I said the river was low and sometimes low water smells bad. She told me to come for dinner. I said maybe tomorrow, which is a lie I tell to myself more than to her. The fifth call came a week later, and it changed the shape of what I thought this was. It didn't come from the cop number. It came from a number I didn't know, a 325 exchange, but that doesn't mean much out here. I answered, stepped instinctively outside to the porch where I could see the sky, and said hello. There was the smallest lag as distance folded. A woman's voice said, "Is this Clint?" I said yes. She said, "Clint, I'm sorry. Please don't hang up. I think you need to know something, and I don't know how to tell you, except to say that I think we are connected." If you have read any of those stories where someone calls and claims to be you from the future, you'll know that this is the part where the reader either clicks away or leans in hard. I didn't feel like I was in a story, felt like I needed to sit down, so I did. On the concrete stoop where the pop bottle cap is wedged into the crack and has been for 2 years, because I always say, "I'll pry it out," and I don't, the woman said. "I think I can prove it to you. Your truck has a crack in the windshield on the passenger side shaped like a U. You did it with the butt of a shovel by accident, when you braked too hard on a washboard road. You left it because you told yourself you'd replace the whole windshield. When you had time, you've been telling yourself that for 8 months. I looked at my truck through the screen and saw the U-shaped crack I had been successfully not seeing until I couldn't." She went on, "Your nephew's name is Logan. Your sister worries about you, but she doesn't like to say it out loud because she thinks that makes things happen. Your shed by the substation has a new coat of paint in a square that doesn't match. You keep a coffee can full of random bolts because your granddad did, and that's how you learned to be." The things she said weren't hard to know if she knew me, if she'd been in my truck and in my life, if she had any connection at all. But the ease with which she said them made me feel rubbery. I said, "Who are you?" Silence, not dead, just thinking. She said, "I think I'm married to you, or I used to be. I don't know how to square the circle. I think I'm calling from a place that is overlaid on yours. I think in my place, you are mine." She said mine like it was a fact she wished wasn't true, because facts like that break things. I know that the last time I saw you, we had a fight about a shed and a river and a decision you wouldn't make. I know that you came home and said you were tired, and you went to sleep in your chair with the TV on, and you smelled like river water. I know that 3 days later, I found a stack of papers in the glove box of your truck with your handwriting on them and a handprint on the top page like someone put their hand there to stop the words. I know you hate being told what to do. No, you get quiet when you're scared, and that is how I know you are scared right now. I asked her name. She said Ellie. I have never known an Ellie well enough to be married to. I said, Ellie, I'm not married. She said, I know. And I'm not sure I am either. Here, I can't find you. I can only find this number. Where are you? I asked. San Angelo, she said. And I looked at my own horizon like, it would shift, but not your San Angelo. Or maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's exactly your San Angelo. It smells like wet hot concrete and someone is grilling 2 blocks away and the birds are yelling at a cat. The difference is thin. I hear your wind sometimes. I hear goats on your side calling at night when there are none near me. I want to tell you I hung up and never took her call again. That would be a sane boundary to set in a world that makes sense. I didn't hang up. I asked her to tell me the color of the blanket on the river rock. She said brown-gray. I asked her what was written on the second page under the date, and she said, don't let him go. And I said, I knew that, and made a sound I didn't know I made when something proves itself in me. She said, like she had been holding her breath and now was exhaling it, Clint, please. I'm going to tell you something, and you're not going to believe me, and I don't want you to, and I also need you to. You have to decide, and you have. To decide without proof, because proof comes after, and then it is too late. She paused, and the line carried the small hiss of spaces rather than words. There is a door that looks like a shed. It isn't. There is a wall that breathes. You already know this. The first time it touched you, it left your hand feeling wrong for a day. You shook it and couldn't shake it loose. You told yourself you had carpal tunnel. It wasn't that. My left hand had in fact felt weak for a day after the shed. It had felt like when you sleep on your arm and wake up and for a second it belongs to someone else. If I had called it out loud then, I could have objected to it. I hadn't. I had let it hang back there with the stack of unasked questions. And now she was pulling it forward and putting it with the others where it looked like a line. She said, you keep trying to brace the door. You keep thinking if you stand in front of it, it has to stay shut. That is not what the door wants. Do not open it. Stop checking it. Let it dry out. Walk away. I said, what happens if I don't? The line went weird. I heard my own voice, not on the call, but behind me in the house. A sound I have never been able to hear before, because the space I live in and the space where sounds reflect are usually the same, and this one wasn't. It said, without volume, as if speaking against my ear, if you don't, you will do what you always do. You will give it an inch because you are kind and because you think you are strong. You will let someone else come with you because you hate to say no. You will tell yourself you can make it safe if you go first. You will be wrong. The phone crackled and Ellie said, Clint. And then the call died like a wire cut with a clean diagonal, and my porch was just my porch again. The heat rising off the concrete, a mockingbird modulating its nonsense. I didn't sleep that night, and I still went to work the next morning, and still did the dumb adult thing of going through the motions because bills don't care. I told myself I would not go to the shed. I told myself I would ignore the phone. I told myself I would let the wall breathe and rot and dry and crack and return to being concrete. Around noon, the phone tree buzzed with a substation alarm, not the shed, but a line fault farther west. The caller ID was the real one, and the dispatcher's voice was human and bored. I drove out. I fixed something simple and felt competent and felt that competency as a weight rather than a lift because it meant I could no longer pretend that I was helpless to my own choices. At the end of the day, I sat in the truck as the sun went down and I told myself I wasn't driving to the shed. I turned right. That road doesn't go to the shed. I told myself I needed to make sure the gate was locked because of the kids. I told myself I'd do one last walk of the fence and get the wire tight and then stop. I told myself not to open the door, and when I got there, the door was already unlocked. The padlock hung open on the hasp like a stone tongue. I didn't want to touch it. I curled my fingers around the lock and felt it warm from the sun but cold under that, like it had been sitting on ice in a metal tray. I put it on the ground. I opened the door and stood there and didn't step inside because I had promised something to the voice and to Ellie and to myself. The fluorescent didn't flicker when I hit the switch. It came up steady and unhappy. The wall with the paint patch looked dry and looked like paint and looked like something a kid would remark on as sloppy. The smell was faint. The desk with the blotter calendar had a pen on it that I had never seen before, a cheap ballpoint chewed at the end. I backed up and put my hand out and found the doorframe with my fingers, the way a man might put a hand on his wife's shoulder as she steps off a curb. And then I heard a sound that I don't know how to right now, in a way that will make you feel it. It was a sound like a person in the next room, quietly asking for help without yet giving themselves permission to panic. It came from the wall. The wall had a voice like air, forced through a flute someone smashed with a boot. It said, "Please," and I stepped inside without meaning to. I said, "Who is in there?" which is a stupid question to ask a wall. The wall breathed. I put my hand out the way you do to a horse. It pressed back like fish muscle. It spoke, and the words were in a pattern I knew from a story my nephew had told at dinner 2 months earlier about a boy at his school who climbed up in the rafters of the gym and fell and broke both wrists, but kept saying he was fine. It said, "It's okay, and I'm not hurt, and please keep your voice down." And those were the words I use when I want someone to think I have control of a thing I don't have control of. I said Logan because it came out of me like blood. And the wall made a small sound that had nothing to do with air and everything to do with a throat. I stepped back. I walked around the perimeter of the shed like there might be a seam where the wall met itself and I could find it and pry. There wasn't. I picked up the coffee can of bolts because that was a thing I could do. I threw a bolt as hard as I could at the wall. It hit and made the sound a bolt makes hitting rock and fell and rolled to the corner where field mice leave seeds. The wall exhaled like a person getting their breath back after a push. It said, "Please," again, and it said it in my nephew's voice, not perfect, not a mimic, but close enough that I could see his mouth forming the shape of the word. The phone rang. I almost didn't hear it over the weird in the room. I dug it out of my pocket. The number was unknown. I answered. I said nothing. Ellie said, "You're there." I said I didn't open the door. It was open, like that. Mattered to anything. She said, "Listen to me. There is a moment where you can still choose. You think the choice is whether to go or stay. It's not. The choice is who. You will not make the choice if you believe you can carry both. You can't. The door won't take two." I felt something like a clarity that was not peace. "Happens if I walk away?" I asked. She said, "You live a life where you don't know what was on the other side. You'll hear a sound sometimes in your house, and you will tell yourself it is pipes, and you will be right and wrong. You will go to the river, and you will see a blanket without a person, and you will not touch it, and you will go home, and you will sleep through the night, and you will wake with your teeth aching. You will be lonely in a way that has nothing to do with being alone. You will not die for a long time. That is what people do. And if I go?" I said. She didn't answer, for a breath that filled up the whole shed. Then she said, very quietly, "Then at least one of us gets to stop wondering." I don't want to lie. I did not stand there in full knowledge of the shape of the universe and choose the way a saint chooses. I stood there like a small, dumb animal. I put my hand on the wall and felt the breath push back, and I thought of my nephew when he was a baby. The way he would put his whole palm over my eye as if he could close the world for me. I thought of the stupid U-shaped crack in my windshield that I had let become part of the backdrop of my days. I thought of my sister's face the time. I told her I was fine, and she looked at me like she knew what I was doing and let me do it because that is how we were raised. I thought of the truck without lights and my voice saying, "Please." I thought of Ellie on a porch that is and isn't mine, calling across a gap that is and isn't here. I thought of the handprint in the shed and the way it had been the same size as mine and how I had told myself it meant nothing. I thought of the fact that I couldn't carry both. I said, "Logan, don't move," because it made me feel like I could fix the shape of the world by telling it not to shift. I stepped backward to the door and I put my hand on the frame. I said to the air and to Ellie and to the wall and to whatever the shed was pretending to be, "I'm coming." And I heard Ellie make a sound that wasn't a word and was the sound a person makes when the choice is the one they were begging you not to make and they still love you inside it. Then I did the thing I will never know how to explain to anyone who has not felt it. I leaned into the wall until it leaned back like skin, and then like mouth, and then like water, and then like a road that has always been there. There is a moment when you step off into a river where the water takes the weight of you and you feel for a heartbeat both heavier and lighter. The wall made me feel that, except instead of cool, it was the temperature of my own breath, and instead of the push on my knees, it was the push on the best memory I own. I expected dark because that is what stories teach you to expect. It wasn't dark. It was the light you get inside your eyelids when you stand facing the sun with your eyes closed, red and gold shot with blue like blood thinned with sky. It didn't last long. I was through it, and then I was in a room that was not a room. Like a shed isn't a door. I was standing on a floor that felt like rock, and like wood, and like the give of the bank under the tamarisk. The air smelled like the inside of a paper bag, and like my father's hands, and like the first second after a match goes out. The walls were not walls. They were suggestion. Sometimes they looked like cinder block. Sometimes they looked like chain link. Sometimes I could see beyond them awash with boot prints leading up to a fence that had been pulled and retwisted by hands. There were places where the world I know overlapped with a world I was never taught. My eyes wanted to tear. Trying to hold both across from me was a shape that the part of me that lived without words recognized first. I said Logan, and the shape that was my nephew turned its head and made a sound with my name in it, and I moved toward him. It hit something like a pane of cold glass that hadn't been there until I touched it. He raised his hand and put it where mine hit, and his fingers and mine lined up, except for the little finger that offset just slightly because of the angle, or maybe because of what this is. Behind him was a woman. She was not someone I knew. She was someone, the part of me that had started to be taught new, like a song. She looked at me like she had forgotten how fear works, like it was supposed to keep a person safe, and had been keeping her awake instead. She said, "Clint," and it was a prayer and a curse and a math problem that has no true solution. Somewhere a phone rang, and it was my phone and not my phone, and it was the coop, and it was a number I didn't know, and it was a bell a teacher rings to line children up after recess. The sound went on until it didn't. I put my forehead against the knock glass, and my nephew put his forehead against the other side. And for a second, the press of it convinced me we were touching, and that would have been enough to live on for 10th. "A year," I said. "Are you okay?" And he said, "I think so." And then he said, "Where is this?" And I said, "I don't know." And Ellie said, "Please come back." And it wasn't clear who she was speaking to, and I understood that this was the choice laid down in a way my bones could not pretend not to understand. The wall, or door, or river, or bridge wanted weight. It wanted to know which of us it would carry. In the room that wasn't a room, I could see 3 places at once. I could see the shed I had stepped into with the fluorescent buzzing and the coffee can and the blotter calendar open to a day that always comes back. I could see the wash beyond the fence with the boot prints that came and went and came and stopped. I could see a river shelf of rock with a wool blanket and 2 enamel mugs and a stack of papers under a clip with my handwriting on the second page, saying a sentence I didn't want tied to my name. The places were not separate. They were angles. Of the same hinge, I did the human thing. I tried to bargain. I said, "Take me," and let him go, like an old story. And the room made no sound, because the room isn't a person, and doesn't need to be, just because I needed it to be. My nephew said, "Uncle Clint," the way he used to say it when his kite got caught on the fence and he needed me to pretend not to see that he'd been uncareful. Ellie said nothing. She was working at something with her hands I couldn't see. Her mouth was a tight line that meant not prayer and not cursing, but concentration, which is the thing that lives underneath both. Then things moved fast and slow in the way time does when it is being used. The wall flexed like a lung. The glass that wasn't shattered like a windshield hit just the wrong way by a shovel, but for a second I felt the truck without lights, and I smelled the hot penny sky, and I heard my voice in my ear saying the kind of thing I hate to hear, where love hides behind command. I put both hands on the pane that had cracked and pushed and felt it give at the bottom, like ice on a stock tank in January when the sun comes out for half an hour. My nephew slid his hands down to follow it. He said, "It hurts," and I said, "I know." And he said it again, and I said, "I know" again. And the room took that as an answer with a kind of awful courtesy. I didn't know I was standing on. The weight passed from my palms into the floor, in a line that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with the way choices travel. I would like to tell you that I pulled him through. That is not what happened. I would like to tell you that the door gave back what I asked for, because sometimes stories do that when a person is brave enough. What happened was that the door made space for exactly one of us to move. My body knows how to lift a sack of feet and how to catch a falling ladder and how to take a kid's weight when he jumps without warning. It knows how to make a path with my own muscles. It tried to do that here and almost succeeded, and if almost was good enough, I would not be writing this. I saw his eyes. They were the green-brown color you get in the shallow pools beside the river where the fish fan their nests. I saw the old scar on his lip from when he fell off the trailer and bit. Through it, I saw Ellie's hand on his shoulder and the ring I do not wear on her finger. I put my mouth near the break in the knot glass and said, very softly, because sometimes the only gift you can give a person is to speak without letting fear hear you. "You go," and he said. "You go," and he is 14 and doesn't yet know that there are times you make a person forgive you by not arguing. I reached for him, and he did the thing that finally decides what this is, which is that he stepped back. I was not prepared for that. He stepped back because he has been watching me for his whole life, and he has learned that sometimes the answer is to give a person the exact thing they want so they can see that they don't. I fell forward. The pain let me. I hit the floor of the shed hard enough to knock my knee against the desk and send the blotter calendar skittering. The fluorescent hummed. The smell was less than before, faint old. I turned stupid. Heart punched into my throat, and the wall at my back was wall. Unhelpful and dry and concrete, the paint patch dull. The coffee can was on its side with 3 bolts out. The door was open till late afternoon and the sound of cicadas beginning. I scrambled up and hit the wall with the flat of my hand and then the heel. And then my shoulder, and then both palms, and the wall didn't breathe. It was a wall, a thing I have loved all my life for being itself. And I hated it for that with a ferocity that left me shaking. My phone was on the floor where it had fallen. It rang as I picked it up. The number was unknown and known, and the sound of the ring was the same as it ever was, and not. I answered and said nothing. Ellie said, not crying, because she is not someone who wastes water. It's done. I said, I don't know what I did, and she said, you chose the thing you can live with. I said, I don't know if I can, and she said, with a steadiness that made me want to sleep for a day, you will. And then she said, I think this line won't hold much longer. If it doesn't, please don't try to call it. Please. Don't go back to the shed. Please don't teach that place your name again. We said nothing for a while, and that was the most we had said. Then the line went dead with a clean, soft cut, and the shed was suddenly nothing but a room with a bad paint job, and my hand hurt like I had punched something with all my kind remaining. When I left the shed, the sun was low enough to throw the fence into a long shadow shape. A second fence laid over the first at a slant. The wind had gone to ground. I locked the gate. I put the padlock through the hasp and closed it and turned the numbers to 0, which is a childish thing to do, and I did it anyway. On the county road, I stopped at the wash and looked for prints because I could not stop being myself. There were a lot. Some were old, some were mine. Some were deer. Some were where a coyote dragged its belly. 2 sets came up to the fence and hesitated the way a body hesitates at water that looks warm and is cold. 1 set went away. 1 set did not go anywhere I could follow. I did not go home right away. I drove to the bluff at the edge of town where you can see the lights come on in a line as people get home from work and remember to flip the switch. I sat in my truck and watched the town decide to be night. My phone did not ring. I waited anyway. There are people who would say that what happened to me could have a normal explanation. There are people who would say the explanation does not matter. There are people who would tell me that doors that want one person do not want another, and it is not about fair. I do not know what I would tell those people. I know that when I went to my sister's house to return Logan's hat he had left on my passenger seat, he met me at the porch with a face that had grown an inch of bone. He said, hey, like he wasn't sure if I was mad at him. I said, you're fine, and corrected myself because I heard the lie in that and said, we're fine, which is not the same. He looked at me like he could hear me learning to use new words, and he gave me that and went back inside to the smell of chicken frying. I went home and put the blanket back in my truck because I am not finished being who I am. I sat at the table and took a pen and wrote the date 07/17 at the top of a page, and then I put my hand on it and pressed and held because I needed to see if my hand would stain it. It didn't. Not then. I tried to sleep and failed. I put on the TV and the weatherman told me there would be storms rolling up from the Pecos that might fizzle before they reached us. And I turned off the TV because sometimes you have to accept that the thing that keeps you company is the thing that keeps you from hearing what you have to. If you made it this far, thank you. I don't know what I am asking you to tell me. Maybe that I made the right choice. Maybe that there was no right 1. Maybe that the shed is a story that other people have known how to keep behind them, and I am late to learn. Maybe you will tell me that you have a door somewhere that breathes and it wants one person, and you are standing in front of it with your hand out, sure that if you press hard enough, you can push the world back into place. If you are, I want to say this in a way that lets you keep your pride. I want to say, please consider stepping away. Please consider that touching a thing teaches it your name. Please consider that there are some decisions that will take your measure and give you back exactly enough to live with, which is not the same as enough to live well. It has been 3 weeks since the shed breathed. It has been 3 weeks since Ellie's voice reached me through a line thin as a hair. The blotter calendar is still open on my kitchen table, and I do not turn the page. I have not been to the river. I drive a different road to avoid the dip and rise that feels like a throat. Some nights I wake up and my left hand is asleep and I shake it and I cannot tell whether it is returning to me or I am returning to it. Some mornings I find that I have written my name on a scrap of paper and set it under my coffee mug like a coaster, as if weighing it down will keep it from being called. If the phone rings while I am writing this, I will not answer. That's what I tell myself. That is the story I'm practicing. I put the phone face down. I say the words out loud, and they are almost true, and I will keep saying them until they are. And if they are not, then I will at least have written this down so the part of me that believes in fences can see what a door looks like and decide from farther away. I can't promise I won't go back. I can't promise anything except that I will try to keep certain names out of certain rooms. If I fail, I hope whoever hears me understands I didn't mean to teach the world how to say me. I meant to hold it shut. I meant to protect the person who stepped back because he learned from me what it looks like to let someone you love make the wrong choice and then stay. There is thunder tonight on the far side of the horizon. I am going to leave the blinds open and watch for the lightning that sometimes never arrives. I am going to sit on the stoop where the bottle cap is stuck and not pry it out because you don't always get to finish small jobs. I'm going to listen to the mockingbird and the goats that aren't there and the pipes in the walls, and I am going to tell myself that sounds are just sounds. And if I wake at 3 to my own voice saying, "Turn around," I am going to lie very still and let it pass through me like weather until morning, when the sky is ordinary and merciless, and I can go to work and fix something with my hands. That has to be enough. If it isn't, then one day you'll read about a man who leaned into a wall until it took his measure and gave him back exactly what he asked for, in a shape he didn't know how to carry. And you'll know I kept walking toward the thing that scared me because I am not brave and not wise, and because choices have a weight whether you pick them up or not. And because once a door learns your name, it says it out loud until you answer. Do you like this personality?